The overhead lights in courtroom 4D buzzed with the same mechanical hum they'd carried for 30 years, casting rectangular shadows across the wooden gallery benches where two families sat divided by grief that had calcified into permanent positions. At the defense table, a man named Rook, 46 years old now, his hair graying at the temples, his hands calloused from decades of prison work, straightened the collar of a dress shirt his attorney had purchased for him the day before, the fabric stiff and unfamiliar against skin that had known only state-issued uniforms since he was 21. His lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman everyone called North, adjusted the stack of pleadings in front of her, the top brief bearing a title that would have seemed impossible just 2 years ago: Motion to Vacate Conviction based on newly discovered exculpatory DNA evidence. Across the aisle, the prosecutor assigned to respond, a methodical career attorney known as Slate, kept his gaze fixed on his laptop, though anyone watching closely would notice his cursor hadn't moved in several minutes. Behind the bench, Judge Keystone reviewed the forensic report one final time, her reading glasses perched low on her nose, her expression neutral in the way only experienced jurists can manage when they know the entire courtroom is searching for a preview of the ruling to come. In the witness box sat a forensic analyst named Juniper, her credentials impeccable, her demeanor professional, waiting to explain how a biological sample preserved in an evidence freezer for 26 years had just rewritten the entire narrative of this case. The sample had been there all along, logged, sealed, stored at the Arcadia lab under case number 98CR4471. While Rook aged behind razor wire, while appeals were filed and denied, while the technology that would eventually prove his innocence evolved from theoretical possibility to forensic standard practice. The paradox that had brought everyone into this room on a Friday morning in late autumn was simple and devastating. The system had convicted Rook based on evidence it considered sufficient beyond a reasonable doubt. Yet the one piece of physical evidence that could have answered the central question definitively, whose DNA was present at the crime scene, had never been tested because the technology wasn't ready and nobody with power had asked the right questions at the right time. But to understand why this moment carried the weight it did, you had to go back to the beginning, to an August night, 26 years earlier, when Rook was 20 years old and his future stretched ahead of him like an open highway, before a brutal crime in a factory parking lot and a single mistaken identification collapsed that future into a 6x9 cell. If you've followed wrongful conviction cases before, or if the procedural and forensic details in this story raise questions you want to explore, leave a comment below and subscribe so you don't miss the next investigation into how evidence, memory, and time intersect in the criminal justice system. The crime took place on August 14th in Riverbend, a mid-sized industrial city built around textile manufacturing and distribution warehouses. The kind of place where shift work defined the rhythm of community life and parking lots emptied in waves at midnight and 6 a.m. A 23-year-old woman named Lark worked the evening shift at Riverbend Textiles, clocking out at 11:15 p.m. through the employee entrance on the building's south side. The parking lot behind the factory was a rectangle of gravel bordered by chain-link fencing on the west side, a drainage culvert running along the north edge, and a row of rusted dumpsters marking the eastern boundary where the property line met an abandoned lot overgrown with weeds. Lighting was minimal, 2 sodium vapor poles at opposite corners, their bulbs dim with age and insect accumulation, casting more shadow than illumination. The nearest security camera pointed toward the loading docks where valuable shipments were staged, its angle useless for monitoring employee parking. Lark walked to her sedan, a 10-year-old compact parked in the third row, keys already in her hand. She never made it inside. A co-worker named Finch, leaving 6 minutes behind her, heard muffled sounds near the dumpsters and found Lark on the gravel, her clothing torn, her throat marked with bruises from strangulation that had stopped just short of fatal. Finch called for help. The first patrol unit arrived within 8 minutes. Paramedics transported Lark to Riverbend General Hospital, where a sexual assault nurse examiner named Iris performed a comprehensive evidence collection according to protocol. Clothing seized and bagged separately, photographs of injuries documenting defensive wounds on Lark's forearms and ligature marks around her neck. Swabs taken from multiple body sites to capture any biological material the assailant might have transferred during the attack. Each item was sealed in evidence packaging, labeled with case information and Iris's initials, logged into the Granite County Sheriff's Office evidence system at 2:17 a.m. and transported to the Arcadia lab for forensic analysis. The lead investigator assigned to the case was a detective named Harbour, a 30-year veteran with a reputation for thoroughness and a clearance rate that kept him in good standing with command staff. He worked the scene methodically in the pre-dawn hours, photographing tire impressions in the gravel, collecting a cigarette butt found near the western fence line, recovering a small torn fragment of dark fabric caught on the chain link that might have come from the assailant's jacket or sleeve during a struggle or flight. He interviewed Finch, who could describe only what she'd found, not what she'd witnessed. He interviewed the night shift supervisor, who confirmed that Lark had clocked out on time and that no other employees had reported seeing anything unusual in the parking lot. The physical evidence was suggestive, but not definitive. No clear fingerprints, no wallet or identification dropped at the scene, no convenient witness who'd watched the attack unfold. Harbour's most important interview came 2 days later when he canvassed the residential streets surrounding the factory. A man named Crow, who lived in a trailer park on Maple Street 2 blocks north of the textile plant, told detectives he'd been outside smoking around 11:30 that night and had seen a man walking quickly past his property line, heading south toward the factory area. Crow's description was specific: white male, early 20s, medium build, wearing a dark jacket, possibly denim or canvas, and moving with what Crow characterized as nervous energy, looking over his shoulder repeatedly. When Harbour showed Crow a photo array 3 days later, Crow identified Rook without hesitation, tapping the photograph and stating he was 95% certain this was the man he'd seen. Crow's certainty was persuasive, but context mattered. Crow had a criminal history: 2 prior convictions for possession of methamphetamine, 1 dismissed charge for receiving stolen property, and a pending case for possession with intent to distribute that was scheduled for preliminary hearing the following month. Harbour's case notes documented that Crow was cooperative and that his pending charge was mentioned in passing, but there was no written agreement, no formal memorandum promising leniency in exchange for testimony. What the file did show, buried in the prosecutor's records, was that Crow's pending distribution case was resolved 6 weeks after Rook's indictment with a plea to simple possession and a sentence of probation, a resolution dramatically more favorable than the 3 to 5 year prison term the original charge carried. Rook became a suspect based primarily on Crow's identification and circumstantial proximity. He lived in Riverbend, about a mile from the factory, in a duplex he shared with his mother. He was 20 years old, unemployed at the time, but looking for work, with no significant criminal history beyond a sealed juvenile shoplifting offense from when he was 16. On the night of August 14th, Rook's alibi was simple and uncorroborated. He'd been home watching late-night television, alone in the living room while his mother slept in her bedroom on the other side of the duplex. No receipts placing him elsewhere, no phone calls logged at relevant times, no neighbors who could testify to seeing his car parked in the driveway or lights on in the windows. In the calculus of investigation, absence of evidence often becomes suspicious rather than exculpatory. Harbour arrested Rook on September 2nd, executing the warrant at 6 a.m. when Rook answered the door in sweatpants and a t-shirt, confusion written across his face. At the sheriff's office, Rook was read his Miranda rights and asked if he'd be willing to answer questions. He agreed, waiving counsel, a decision that would haunt him for decades, because innocent people, he believed, don't need lawyers, and cooperation demonstrates truthfulness. The interrogation lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes. It was not recorded on video or audio. Departmental policy at the time required recording only for homicides and certain high-profile cases. What existed in the case file was a 3-page typed summary prepared by Harbour afterward, describing Rook's responses as evasive and inconsistent, noting that Rook became defensive when confronted with Crow's identification and the timeline, and documenting that Rook denied any involvement repeatedly but could offer no concrete proof of where he'd been or what he'd been doing at 11:30 p.m. on August 14th. The forensic analysis from Arcadia Lab came back during pre-trial proceedings. The serologist assigned to the case, this was years before DNA profiling became standard, confirmed the presence of seminal fluid on swabs taken from Lark's clothing and body, typed the material using ABO blood grouping and enzyme markers, and determined that it was consistent with secretor status for a male donor with type O blood. The analysis was scientifically sound for its time, but profoundly limited. Approximately 43% of the population shares type O blood, and secretor status narrows the pool only marginally. Rook was type O. So were millions of others. The serology could not exclude him, but it could not include him either. It was a forensic dead end that left the question of identity unanswered. The trial began in October, 14 months after Lark's attack in the Granite County Courthouse, a neoclassical brick building with high ceilings and wooden benches worn smooth by decades of witnesses and defendants. The lead prosecutor was an assistant district attorney named Ember, a pragmatic veteran known for building cases on accumulated circumstantial evidence when direct proof was unavailable. Ember's theory was straightforward. Rook had been in the vicinity of the factory that night, had seen Lark leaving alone, had acted on impulse or opportunity, and had fled when Finch's arrival interrupted the attack. The case rested on 3 pillars: Crow's eyewitness identification, Rook's lack of alibi, and the forensic evidence that, while inconclusive, did not exclude him. Crow testified on the second day of trial. He took the stand in a button-down shirt and slacks, his demeanor respectful and cooperative, his testimony delivered with confidence. He described what he'd seen on Maple Street, identified Rook in court as the man he'd observed that night, and withstood cross-examination without significant contradiction. The defense attorney, a court-appointed public defender named Grafton, overworked and underfunded, handling 37 active cases simultaneously, pressed Crow on lighting conditions, distance, and the possibility of misidentification. But Crow held firm. He'd seen what he'd seen. When Grafton asked about Crow's pending drug case, Ember objected on relevance grounds, and Judge Keystone sustained the objection. The jury never heard that Crow's case had been resolved favorably just weeks after the indictment. Lark testified on the 3rd day. She was composed but visibly emotional, describing the attack in halting language, her voice breaking when she recounted the sensation of hands around her throat and the certainty she was going to die. When asked if she could identify her attacker in the courtroom, she shook her head. The trauma, the darkness, the terror, it had all conspired to fragment her memory of facial features. She could describe his approximate size, the rough texture of his jacket, the smell of cigarette smoke, but she could not point at Rook and say with certainty that he was the man. The prosecution didn't need her to. They had Crow for that. The forensic testimony came from the Arcadia Lab serologist, a technician named Quill, who had performed the blood typing analysis. Quill explained the science in plain language, how ABO typing works, what secretor status means, how enzyme markers provide additional differentiation, but also acknowledged the limitations. The biological material recovered from Lark's clothing matched millions of potential donors. It did not exclude Rook, but it did not affirmatively identify him either. When Grafton asked whether more definitive testing was possible, Quill explained that DNA profiling using RFLP or PCR methods was available but expensive, required substantial sample quantities, and was typically reserved for cases where identity was the sole contested issue and where funding could be secured. No motion for DNA testing had been filed pre-trial, and Grafton lacked the resources to hire an independent expert to advocate for it. Grafton's defense case was brief. He called Rook to the stand, a risky decision, but one driven by desperation. Rook needed to explain himself to the jury in his own words. Rook testified that he'd been home the night of the attack, that he'd never been to the factory parking lot, that he didn't know Lark, that Crow had identified the wrong person. Under Ember's cross-examination, Rook struggled. Why couldn't anyone confirm his alibi? Because he'd been alone. Why had he seemed nervous during the interrogation? Because being accused of a violent crime he didn't commit was terrifying. Why should the jury believe him over Crow, who had no reason to lie? Rook had no answer that sounded convincing. Closing arguments distilled the case to competing narratives. Ember argued that the evidence taken together proved guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. An eyewitness who placed Rook near the scene, forensic evidence consistent with his blood type, and no credible explanation for where he'd been or why Crow would misidentify him. Grafton argued that doubt permeated every element. Crow's identification was unreliable, the serology was inconclusive, and absence of an alibi wasn't proof of guilt. The jury deliberated for 2 days. On the afternoon of November 7th, they returned a verdict, guilty on all counts of sexual assault, attempted murder, and kidnapping. Rook sat motionless as the verdict was read, his hands folded on the table in front of him. His mother, seated in the gallery, lowered her head and wept silently. Lark's family, on the opposite side of the courtroom, embraced. Sentencing came 3 weeks later. Judge Keystone imposed 30 years in state prison, noting the brutality of the crime, the trauma inflicted on the victim, and the jury's determination of guilt. Rook was 21 years old when he was processed into the state correctional system, assigned inmate number 47832, and transported to the Riverbend Correctional Facility, a medium-security institution 6 hours north of the city. His mother attended every visiting day for the first 3 years, making the 12-hour round trip by bus, sitting across from him in the visitation hall where conversations were monitored and physical contact limited to a brief embrace at the beginning and end of each visit. Then she remarried, moved to another state, and the visits grew less frequent. Phone calls replaced visits, then letters replaced phone calls, then the letters stopped. The architecture of Rook's 20s and 30s was built from routines designed to strip away individuality and enforce compliance. Wake at 5:30 to the metallic clang of automatic locks releasing, count standing at the cell door while guards walked the tiers, confirming head count. Breakfast in the chow hall where trays were passed through slots and conversation was monitored for tone and volume. Work detail in the prison laundry or the license plate shop where inmates manufactured tags for state vehicles. Afternoon recreation in the yard where groups self-segregated along invisible lines of race and affiliation. Dinner at 4:30, evening count at 6, lockdown at 8, lights out at 10. Weekends offered marginal variation. Longer yard time, access to the law library, occasional programming like GED classes or substance abuse counseling. Holidays were marked by slightly better food and phone call privileges, but the calendar became an abstraction. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into years. Rook filed his first appeal while still represented by Grafton, arguing ineffective assistance of counsel based on Grafton's failure to request DNA testing when the serology came back inconclusive. The appellate brief, drafted by Grafton himself, with assistance from a paralegal, argued that prevailing professional standards required defense counsel to pursue exculpatory forensic testing when available, and that Grafton's failure to do so prejudiced the defense by leaving a critical question unanswered. The state appellate court denied relief in a published opinion, noting that DNA testing in that era required a court order, substantial justification, a showing that results would be material to the defense, and funding that wasn't automatically provided. And that Grafton's decision not to pursue testing fell within the range of reasonable strategic choices given resource constraints and the uncertain outcome of such testing. Rook's second appeal, filed pro se after his relationship with Grafton dissolved, argued that Crow's testimony should have been impeached with evidence of the favorable resolution of his pending drug case, and that the trial court erred in sustaining the relevance objection during cross-examination. The appellate court denied relief on procedural grounds. The issue hadn't been preserved at trial because Grafton hadn't made an offer of proof detailing what the impeachment evidence would show. And appellate courts don't review unpreserved claims except in cases of plain error affecting substantial rights, a standard the court concluded wasn't met. By the time Rook turned 30, he'd exhausted his direct appeals and learned the bitter mathematics of post-conviction litigation, motions filed, briefing deadlines, oral arguments, if you were fortunate enough to be granted them, orders denying relief on procedural bars, or deference to trial court findings, the cycle beginning again with diminishing prospects. But two factors kept Rook's case from disappearing entirely into the archives of forgotten convictions. First, Granite County had implemented an evidence retention policy in the early 90s requiring biological evidence in violent felonies to be preserved indefinitely unless a court specifically ordered destruction, a policy driven by early exoneration cases in other jurisdictions where evidence had been discarded and questions could never be answered. The swabs and slides from Lark's assault kit, having completed their initial serology analysis, were transferred to a long-term evidence freezer at Arcadia Lab, stored at -20°C in sealed tubes labeled with case number, date of collection, and chain of custody documentation. They sat there while forensic science evolved from RFLP analysis, requiring large sample quantities, to PCR-based STR profiling requiring only trace amounts, from 13 loci panels to expanded panels testing 20 or more genetic markers, from manual interpretation to probabilistic genotyping software that could separate mixed profiles and calculate statistical weights with extraordinary precision. Second, a legal clinic at the State University began reviewing old convictions where biological evidence existed but had never been subjected to modern DNA testing. The clinic was directed by a law professor named Vale, a former public defender who'd spent 15 years in the trenches before moving to academia, and who understood that wrongful convictions weren't anomalies but predictable products of systemic weaknesses: eyewitness misidentification, informant testimony, forensic limitations, inadequate defense representation, and finality doctrines that prioritized closure over accuracy. Vale called the initiative the Conviction Integrity Project. In the spring of Rook's 19th year of incarceration, his case file crossed Vale's desk, flagged by a second-year law student named Wren, who'd been searching appellate databases for cases mentioning biological evidence and inconclusive forensic results. Wren and her partner, a third-year student named Pike, spent 3 months reconstructing the case. They obtained the complete trial transcript, the appellate briefs, Harbor's investigation file through a public records request, and the Arcadia Lab's chain of custody records, confirming that the evidence kit still existed and remained in secure storage. They found inconsistencies in Crow's timeline that had never been fully explored at trial, witness statements from factory co-workers that contradicted portions of the prosecution's theory, and Grafton's handwritten trial notes showing he'd considered requesting DNA testing but had abandoned the idea after learning the cost would exceed $10,000 and that the trial court was unlikely to grant funding without a stronger showing of materiality. Most importantly, they confirmed that the biological material recovered from Lark's assault had never been compared to Rook's DNA profile, because no profile had ever been generated. The serology had answered one question, but left the central question of identity unresolved. Vail drafted a post-conviction motion under the state's newly enacted statute, allowing inmates to petition for DNA testing when the results could reasonably be expected to establish actual innocence and where such testing hadn't been available or requested at trial. The statute, passed 5 years earlier in response to a string of exonerations in neighboring states, set a high bar. The defendant had to show that identity was a genuinely contested issue at trial, that biological evidence existed and remained in a condition suitable for testing, and that DNA results could produce evidence of exculpation that wasn't available through serology or other methods at the time of conviction. Vail's motion checked every box. Rook had consistently denied being at the scene, had maintained his innocence for 19 years, and had filed multiple appeals arguing that DNA testing should have been pursued. The biological evidence was preserved under controlled conditions, and modern STR profiling could now definitively determine whether Rook was or wasn't the donor of the biological material recovered from Lark, a question serology simply couldn't answer with the specificity required for exoneration or confirmation. The district attorney's office, now led by a prosecutor named Quarry, who'd taken office on a platform of smart-on-crime reform and conviction integrity, opposed the motion, but not aggressively. Quarry's response brief argued that the conviction rested on Crow's eyewitness testimony and the totality of circumstantial evidence, not solely on forensic proof, and that even if DNA testing excluded Rook as the donor, it wouldn't necessarily establish innocence, only that someone else's DNA was present, which could be explained by secondary transfer, or the possibility that Lark had been in contact with multiple people that evening. But Quarry's tone was measured, and his filing didn't invoke the procedural bars that prosecutors typically deploy to block post-conviction testing. He seemed to recognize that the interests of justice required an answer. Judge Keystone, now in her 24th year on the bench, reviewed the motion over a holiday recess. She'd presided over hundreds of trials, had seen DNA exonerations reported in the news, and understood that forensic science in the 90s had been both less powerful and less scrutinized than contemporary standards demanded. She issued an order granting the motion, directing Arcadia Lab to retrieve the evidence kit, verify chain of custody, and conduct STR profiling on the biological material using current best practices, with a reference sample to be obtained from Rook through the prison medical unit. The order was dated March 22nd, 20 years and 4 months after Rook's conviction. The testing process moved with procedural deliberation. Arcadia Lab retrieved evidence kit 98CR4471 from the freezer in April, confirmed the integrity of seals and labels, and documented the unbroken chain of custody through photographs and written logs. A senior forensic analyst named Juniper, certified in DNA analysis and experienced in cold case reviews, supervised the extraction process. Using a sterile scalpel, she cut a small section from the swab that had been stored in a sealed tube, dissolved the cellular material in buffer solution, and extracted DNA using phenol chloroform purification, followed by centrifugation and precipitation. The extracted DNA was quantified using real-time PCR to ensure sufficient material for amplification, then subjected to STR profiling using a commercial kit that tested 20 autosomal loci plus amylogenin for sex determination. The profile that emerged from the evidence sample was clean, complete, and unambiguous. A single-source male donor with allelic values at all 20 loci tested. Juniper compared the profile to the reference sample collected from Rook, which had been extracted from a buccal swab obtained by the prison nurse and delivered to the lab under seal. The comparison took less than an hour. At every locus, the alleles didn't match. Rook was excluded as the donor of the biological material recovered from Lark's clothing and body, not with 99% probability, but with absolute certainty at the resolution current technology could provide. The probability that the evidence profile and Rook's profile would match by random chance, given the observed differences, was zero. He wasn't the source. Juniper didn't stop there. She uploaded the evidence profile to CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, which contains millions of profiles from convicted offenders, arrestees, and forensic casework from unsolved crimes. The search returned a hit within 72 hours. The profile matched a man named Talon, who had been convicted in a neighboring county 3 years after Rook's trial for a nearly identical crime: sexual assault and attempted strangulation of a woman in an isolated parking lot at night. Talon's DNA had been collected as part of his sentence and entered into CODIS as required by state law. The match wasn't close or probable. It was a 20 for 20 allele match with a random match probability calculated at 1 in several trillion, far exceeding the threshold for forensic certainty. Juniper prepared her report with meticulous care, knowing it would be scrutinized by attorneys, judges, and possibly appellate courts. She documented the extraction protocol, the amplification conditions, the allele calls at each locus, the statistical calculations supporting the exclusion of Rook and the inclusion of Talon, and the CODIS hit confirmation. She attached electropherograms showing the peaks and valleys that represented genetic markers, photographs of the evidence kit documenting seal integrity, and chain of custody logs proving the sample had been handled properly from collection through analysis. The report was 93 pages plus appendices, and its conclusion was unequivocal. The DNA profile recovered from Lark's assault kit matched Talon, not Rook. Vale filed a supplemental motion within a week of receiving Juniper's report, attaching the full forensic analysis and a memorandum arguing that the DNA evidence directly contradicted the prosecution's theory of the case and established Rook's actual innocence. The motion detailed Talon's criminal history, prior arrests for assault in 2 other counties before Rook's trial, the conviction 3 years later for a crime nearly identical to Lark's attack, and a documented pattern of behavior that fit the modus operandi of Lark's assault. Vale argued that had this DNA evidence been available at trial, no reasonable jury could have convicted Rook beyond a reasonable doubt, and that the interests of justice required immediate relief. Quarry's office faced a decision. They could fight the motion, argue that Crow's identification remained credible and that DNA alone didn't disprove Rook's involvement, and force an evidentiary hearing where they'd be compelled to defend a conviction that rested on a mistaken eyewitness and inconclusive serology, while a convicted rapist's DNA was found at the scene. Or they could acknowledge the truth. After conferring with his senior staff and reviewing Talon's file, which showed he'd been living in Riverbend at the time of Lark's attack, had worked at a warehouse 2 miles from the textile factory, and had never been investigated in connection with her case because he hadn't been arrested for a similar crime until 3 years later, Quarry chose the latter. His response brief stated that the DNA evidence was materially exculpatory and highly probative of actual innocence. that the office would not oppose the motion to vacate, and that dismissal of charges would be appropriate pending any new information that might emerge from a reinvestigation. Judge Keystone set an evidentiary hearing for the first Friday in November, 26 years and 2 months after Rook's conviction. The courtroom was the same one where he'd been sentenced, the benches polished from decades of use, the flags hanging in the corners slightly faded but still crisp. Rook entered through the side door, reserved for in-custody defendants, accompanied by 2 corrections officers, wearing the dress shirt North had purchased for him, and the same slacks he'd worn to countless parole hearings that had gone nowhere. He took his seat beside North, who'd assembled 3 binders of motions, exhibits and case law, though she knew the outcome was no longer in doubt. Slate sat at the prosecution table, his posture professional but resigned. The gallery filled slowly. 2 journalists from the Riverbend Gazette, a documentary producer who'd been following the Conviction Integrity Project, 3 law students from Vale's Clinic, and Lark, now 49 years old, seated near the center aisle, with an advocate from a victims' rights organization who'd helped her navigate the emotional complexity of learning that the man who'd attacked her had been convicted of attacking someone else, while Rook sat in prison. Juniper took the stand first, sworn in and seated in the witness box with a binder containing her report and supporting documentation. North walked her through the science step by step, translating technical language into accessible explanations for the record. Juniper described how STR profiling works, polymerase chain reaction amplifying specific regions of DNA, capillary electrophoresis separating fragments by size, fluorescent labels allowing detection, software comparing allelic peaks to reference standards. She explained the statistical foundation. Each genetic marker inherits 1 allele from each parent, creating a profile unique to that individual except in cases of identical twins, and the probability of 2 unrelated individuals sharing the same profile at 20 loci is measured in trillions to 1. She walked through the comparison between the evidence profile and Rook's reference sample, pointing to the electropherograms on a screen where mismatched peaks at locus after locus made the exclusion visually undeniable. She described the CODIS hit, the confirmation protocol that verified Talon's profile, and the reanalysis she'd conducted to rule out contamination or laboratory error. Under cross-examination, Slate asked measured questions, his tone professional rather than adversarial. Could the DNA have been deposited through secondary transfer? Say, if Lark had shaken hands with someone earlier that day and that person's DNA transferred to her clothing. Juniper acknowledged that secondary transfer is theoretically possible, but explained that the quantity, location, and cellular material present in the sample were consistent with direct primary contact during the assault. Seminal fluid deposited through sexual contact, not trace touch DNA that might transfer innocently. Could there have been a laboratory error in the original serology or in her current analysis? Juniper walked through the quality control measures, the use of negative and positive controls, the independent verification of results by a second analyst, and the unbroken chain of custody showing the sample had been properly stored and handled. Slate asked no further questions. Harbour testified next, reluctant but subpoenaed. Now 73 years old, retired for a decade, he took the stand in a sport coat and bolo tie, his posture upright but his voice quieter than it had been during trial. North asked him to describe the original investigation, and Harbour recounted the scene work, the evidence collection, the interviews. When North asked about Crow, Harbour confirmed that Crow had been the key witness, that his identification had driven the decision to arrest Rook, and that Crow's pending drug case had been mentioned during interviews. North introduced documents showing that Crow's case had been resolved 6 weeks after Rook's indictment with a plea deal that spared him prison time. Had Harbour offered Crow any benefit in exchange for his testimony? Harbour said no, not explicitly, but acknowledged that prosecutors and detectives sometimes have informal understandings about cooperation. North didn't press further. The point was made. Had Harbour requested DNA testing during the investigation? Harbour said the serology had been the standard practice at the time, that DNA testing was expensive and not routinely available, and that the serology results were considered sufficient to move forward with prosecution, given Crow's identification. The final witness was Talon, transported from the state penitentiary, where he was serving life without parole for his subsequent conviction. He entered the courtroom in shackles, flanked by guards, his appearance hardened by years inside. North called him to the stand, but before she could ask a question, Talon's court-appointed attorney stated that his client would invoke his Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination and would not testify. North nodded and dismissed him. His presence alone had been the point. The jury needed to see the man whose DNA was at the scene, whose criminal history matched the crime, whose existence proved the system had convicted the wrong person. In closing, North argued that the DNA evidence didn't create reasonable doubt. It demolished the case entirely. Rook's profile was excluded. Talon's was included with statistical certainty measured in trillions. Crow's identification, however well-intentioned, was wrong. The serology that couldn't exclude Rook at trial had now been superseded by technology that could and did exclude him definitively. The conviction was based on a mistake, and justice required it be vacated. Slate rose briefly to respond, stating that the district attorney's office acknowledged the strength of the DNA evidence, agreed that it was materially exculpatory, and would not oppose the motion to vacate. He added that the office extended its apologies to Rook for the years lost and to Lark for the failure to identify her actual attacker sooner. Judge Keystone took less than an hour to rule. She returned to the bench at 3:15, her written order already prepared, and read the operative paragraphs aloud. The DNA evidence was clear and convincing. It excluded Rook as the source of biological material recovered from the victim. It identified Talon, a convicted offender with a documented history of similar crimes, as the actual perpetrator. The original conviction rested substantially on eyewitness testimony that was now demonstrated to be mistaken, and on forensic evidence that, when subjected to modern testing, exculpated the defendant. The interests of justice required relief. The court vacated Rook's conviction on all counts, dismissed the charges with prejudice, and ordered his immediate release from custody. The words were procedural, but their effect was seismic. Rook's shoulders dropped, tension he'd carried for 26 years releasing in a single exhale. North placed a hand on his forearm. Her eyes closed briefly in something approaching relief. In the gallery, one of the law students wiped tears. Lark sat motionless, her advocate leaning close to whisper something Rook couldn't hear. The corrections officers unlocked Rook's restraints, the metallic click echoing in the silent courtroom, and escorted him not back to the holding cell, but to the processing area where inmates being released are issued civilian clothing, a check for $40, a bus voucher, and a plastic bag containing whatever personal effects they had at the time of arrest. Rook was processed out at 4:30 that afternoon. The state issued him the standard gate money, though the check felt absurd in his hand, $40 for 26 years. His clothing from the arrest had long since been discarded, so the prison gave him donated jeans, a t-shirt that didn't fit, and a jacket too thin for November weather. North drove him to a halfway house operated by a re-entry non-profit on the edge of Riverbend, a 2-story building with shared rooms and a curfew, where he'd stay until he could find work and secure housing. She handed him a prepaid phone, showed him how to make calls, and left him with her card and instructions to check in twice a week. Rook sat on the narrow bed in the room he'd been assigned, the mattress lumpy but softer than prison bunks, and stared at the wall, For the first time in 26 years, there was no count, no lockdown, no guard walking the tier. The freedom was disorienting. He called his mother that evening from the phone North had given him. She answered on the fourth ring, her voice tentative and unfamiliar. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking on the single syllable. There was silence, then a sound that might have been a sob. They talked for 14 minutes. She cried. He didn't. She told him she was sorry she hadn't visited more, that the distance and her new family had made it difficult, that she'd never stopped believing him. He told her it was okay, that he understood, that he was out now and trying to figure out what came next. She asked if he needed money. He said no. The lawyers were working on compensation. She asked if he'd come visit. He said maybe, when things settled. They agreed to talk again soon. The call ended with the awkwardness of people who'd once known each other intimately but had become strangers. Compensation wasn't automatic. The state had a wrongful conviction statute passed a decade earlier, allowing exonerees to petition for restitution at a rate of $60,000 per year of incarceration, but the process required extensive documentation, a formal finding of actual innocence by a court, and legislative appropriation. North filed the petition in December, attaching Judge Keystone's order, Juniper's forensic report, and a detailed accounting of Rook's incarceration from arrest through release. The petition was reviewed by a 3-member compensation board over 8 months, during which time Rook lived at the halfway house, found work stocking shelves at a warehouse distribution center for $12 an hour, and attended mandatory re-entry programming on resume writing, financial literacy, and anger management. In August, the board approved his claim. The state issued a check for $1,560,000, $60,000 for each of the 26 years he'd served. After attorney fees and taxes, Rook received just over $1 million. It was a sum that would have seemed incomprehensible to the 20-year-old version of himself, but it couldn't purchase back his 20s, his 30s, his mother's presents at holidays, the children he'd never had, the career he'd never built, the life he'd imagined before it was taken. He moved out of the halfway house into a studio apartment above a hardware store on the edge of Riverbend. The walls thin enough that he could hear his neighbor's television through the drywall, but it was his. He bought furniture from a thrift store, a bed, a table, 2 chairs, a lamp. He opened a checking account, learned to use an ATM, bought a used car from a lot that advertised no credit check financing. The routines of freedom were mundane and exhausting. Grocery shopping paralyzed him with too many choices. Smartphones felt like alien technology. Social interactions were minefields of context he didn't understand. References to television shows that had aired while he was inside, political events he'd only heard about second-hand, cultural shifts that had happened without him. He attended a support group for exonerees, facilitated by Vale's Clinic, where men and women with similar stories gathered once a month to talk about the ordinary struggles of re-entry. One man described panic attacks triggered by sirens. A woman talked about the impossibility of explaining a 20-year gap on a resume. Another man admitted he'd violated parole, not because he'd committed a crime, but because he couldn't adapt to a world that had moved on without him. Rook listened more than he spoke, but he kept attending. A year after his release, Lark reached out through the victims' advocacy organization, requesting a mediated meeting. Rook agreed. They met in a conference room at the organization's office, neutral territory, with a trained facilitator present to manage the conversation. Lark sat across from him, older now, her hair graying at the temples, her hands folded on the table. She spoke first, her voice steady but quiet. She told him she was sorry for what had happened, that she'd identified him in good faith under circumstances no one should endure, that she'd carried guilt since learning the truth, guilt that her testimony had helped convict an innocent man, guilt that Talon had been free for 3 additional years. She said she hoped he could find peace, that he could rebuild, that he could forgive her, even though she didn't expect it. Rook listened without interrupting. When she finished, he told her he didn't blame her, that she'd been a victim too, that the system had failed them both. He said he'd spent years angry at Crow, at Harbour, at the prosecutors and judges who denied his appeals, but that anger had only made the time harder. He said he was trying to let it go, not because they deserved forgiveness, but because he deserved to stop carrying it. They talked for 47 minutes. At the end, Lark asked if she could hug him. He hesitated, then nodded. The embrace was brief and awkward, but it was something. The systemic lessons of Rook's case were familiar to anyone who'd studied wrongful convictions, but familiarity doesn't dilute their urgency. Eyewitness identification, even when offered in good faith by victims or bystanders, is profoundly unreliable under conditions of stress, poor lighting, cross-racial recognition, or the passage of time between observation and identification. Research has demonstrated that human memory is reconstructive rather than recording, vulnerable to suggestion from lineups, photo arrays, and leading questions. Informant testimony, particularly from witnesses facing criminal charges, carries inherent credibility risks because cooperation can be explicitly or implicitly rewarded with leniency, and jurors often underestimate the power of those incentives. Forensic science evolves, and techniques considered cutting-edge in one decade can be superseded by methods orders of magnitude more powerful in the next. But only if evidence is preserved, accessible, and subjected to reanalysis when new technology becomes available. Defense counsel, especially court-appointed attorneys managing overwhelming caseloads with minimal resources, often lack the funding to hire independent forensic experts, conduct thorough investigations, or challenge the state's scientific testimony effectively. And appellate systems, built on doctrines of finality, procedural default, and deference to jury verdicts, create steep barriers for defendants seeking relief even when newly discovered evidence emerges that casts doubt on their convictions. Rook's exoneration also underscored the importance of statutory and procedural reforms that many states adopted in the decades after DNA exonerations began exposing systemic failures. Open-file discovery rules, which require prosecutors to disclose all evidence, including exculpatory material, before trial, reduce the risk of Brady violations where favorable evidence is suppressed, and allow defense counsel to investigate alternative suspects and theories. Mandatory recording of interrogations creates a contemporaneous audiovisual record that protects both suspects and investigators, documenting whether confessions were voluntary or coerced, whether suspects understood their rights, and whether interrogation techniques crossed constitutional lines. Post-conviction DNA testing statutes, like the one that allowed Rook to petition for analysis 2 decades after his trial, provide a procedural mechanism for revisiting cases where biological evidence exists and where modern science can answer questions that were unanswerable at the time of conviction. Conviction integrity units, staffed by prosecutors committed to reviewing potential wrongful convictions rather than defending them reflexively, create institutional pathways for self-correction within adversarial systems that otherwise prioritize winning over truth. Compensation statutes, while imperfect and incapable of restoring lost time, at least acknowledge that the state bears financial and moral responsibility when it imprisons the innocent. Eyewitness identification reforms, double-blind lineups, instructions that the perpetrator may not be present, confident statements recorded immediately after identification, reduce the risk of misidentification that drove Rook's conviction. And innocence projects staffed by law students, pro bono attorneys, and investigative journalists provide the labor-intensive case review that overburdened appellate defenders simply cannot perform. But reforms are adopted unevenly, often only after high-profile exonerations generate public pressure, and they come too late for the Rooks of the world, who were convicted before protections existed. For every exoneration, there are cases where evidence was destroyed pursuant to retention policies that prioritized storage costs over justice, where DNA was never collected because the crime predated modern protocols, where appellate deadlines barred review of newly discovered evidence, where no clinic or journalist took interest because the case lacked a compelling narrative or a charismatic defendant. The procedural mechanisms that wrongfully convicted Rook, eyewitness misidentification incentivized by pending charges, forensic limitations accepted without challenge, resource disparities between prosecution and defense, appellate deference to jury verdicts weren't unique to his case. They were features of a system designed to achieve finality and efficiency rather than accuracy and justice. 2 years after his release, Rook moved away from Riverbend. He didn't tell anyone where he was going except North, who needed a forwarding address for tax documents related to his compensation. He'd spent his 20s in a cell, his 30s and early 40s exhausting appeals, and his mid-40s learning to navigate a world that had transformed while he was frozen in time. He wanted anonymity, distance from the courthouse and the factory parking lot, and the faces of people who'd once believed he was guilty. He found a small town 6 hours south, rented a house with a yard, and took a job at a lumber mill where nobody asked about his past. He adopted a dog from the local shelter, a 3-legged mutt named Ash, who slept at the foot of his bed and followed him room to room. He attended a community college class on carpentry, discovering he had a talent for joinery and finish work. He built a bookshelf, then a table, then a cabinet with dovetail joints that fit so precisely they required no glue. The work was meditative, the wood responsive to care and attention in a way the legal system had never been. On a quiet morning in late spring, Rook sat at the kitchen table he'd built himself, drinking coffee from a mug North had given him as a parting gift, the light through the window pale and new. On the counter sat an empty evidence box he'd requested from Arcadia Lab after the case closed, not the actual kit which had been retained as a court exhibit, but a duplicate box with the same labels and case number, a relic of the system that had consumed half his life. He kept it not out of bitterness, but as a reminder that the truth had been there all along, sealed in a freezer, waiting for someone to ask the right question. The box reminded him that evidence doesn't lie, even when witnesses do, even when systems fail, even when decades pass before technology catches up with injustice. If this story raises questions about how wrongful convictions happen, how DNA exonerations work, or what reforms could prevent future cases like Rook's, share your thoughts in the comments below. And subscribe so you don't miss the next investigation into the moments when the system gets it wrong and the mechanisms that sometimes finally make it right.